if I can have your attention, we're going to begin our program in a minute. I'll let a few people take their seats. Welcome, my name is Martin Schwartz. I'm Associate Chair of the Department of Architecture, and this panel discussion this evening is part of our spring lecture series. The panel will be moderated by my friend and colleague Noah Resnick from University of Detroit Mercy. He's director of the Master of Architecture program there and a partner in urban detail. So I'm going to introduce Noah right now, and he can introduce the panel and get our program going.
Thank you, Martin, and I want to thank Lawrence Technological University for having this, and also Mary Miss for joining us for 2 days. We're going to have a sort of informal panel discussion. The title of this panel discussion is the public sphere, and I think we'll at least initially start with some questions about the nature of art in public space. Before we get to that, again, keeping this sort of casual, well, first I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then all of our panelists will have a chance to tell you a little bit about what they do, and then we'll get started. I am the director of the Graduate School of Architecture at U of D, where I also teach urban theory, as well as the master's thesis class. But as principal of urban detail, which is a very, very small sort of one-man office that I run in Detroit. You'll notice if you can read down these things, you'll see my projects are always with something, and that's mostly because I'm lazy, don't like to do all the work myself, but also because I base my practice on collaboration. It's a firm that deals with the architect as collaborator, as well as dealing with issues of urban scale in addition to architectural scale, and the way that small scale, like a detail, can have an impact at the urban level. So I collaborate with artists, I collaborate with the clients who sometimes are designers themselves, and do anywhere from small restaurant renovations to the master plan of a public park, to a small food kiosk in Broadway in Manhattan, where I'm collaborating with a designer as well as a fabricator. Can you not hear me? Well, hopefully you've heard at least a single word I've said so far, but if not, you saw some pretty pictures. And I'll sort of end my intro there and move on to Michael McGillis.
Is there a switch? Is it working now? Much better. Okay, my name is, as you see up there, Michael McGillis. I'm an artist that lives in this area. Okay, great. The work that I do is kind of mostly focused on our relationship with the environment. So I can get a slide. That's not the first slide. Is that the last slide? These are not in order. Oh yeah, they are in order. Okay. I actually have a lot of different projects that they range from site-specific pieces to like microenvironments and models. But what I wanted to do is just focus on one particular recent piece. This is titled "You're Back to the Woods," and it's I've been exploring some of the more wild, or this newly defined wild environments that are around the city. There's places where this natural environment kind of butts up against the built environment. I'm really fascinated by the way that we've kind of revised how we define wilderness, and there's kind of a wildness that's taking place in these little marginalized spaces. And what I am working on here is a kind of an observation space that is did it change? Okay. That is, it's an analog of a felled tree stump, and it kind of functions as a gathering place to observe some of the wild areas outside of our built environment. Mostly coyotes are documented. There's trail camera footage that's playing in loops inside the space. It's kind of like a little, like a basic viewing environment. And really my interest is to sort of highlight these places that are kind of unseen, they're off the radar. It kind of plays into the rest of my work, which is about how we perceive nature, the wilderness, how we kind of interpret our responsibilities and our roles in a natural environment. In that sense. That was just a real basic overview of something that I've done. I'll pass to Mike.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Our next panelist is a twofer. We have Cezanne Charles and John Marshall of Root of Two.
I'm Cezanne.
Okay.
Sorry. That was really loud.
So we're called root of 2, which is the square root of 2. So that's sacred geometry for the division of unity. And again, we are collaborators, so we are a collaborative partnership that also collaborates. So we're sort of collaboration squared. That's us.
Yeah.
That's where you can find us.
Yeah. We have a little mission statement. So our work is really about the future, and we're really trying to reframe those instances where we consider ourselves in the future.
So we're going to try and answer all the questions at once. So back in 1979, Rosalind Krauss wrote this essay called Sculpture in the Expanded Field, in which she wrote about Mary Miss. And I'm a big fan of that essay and of the work that it discusses. So this is our conception of where we are now and the work that our work is in discourse with. So instead of starting from the point of view of sculpture and then going, well, sculpture is that which is not landscape and that which is not architecture. If you take the starting point of digital sculpture as that which is not building design and that which is not product design, and then you expand out from the quaternary field of that to find the possibilities that inhere in like what is happening or discover what is happening in the contemporary field. So this is where we'll locate our practice, and this is what we do. And we're going to talk about 3 projects in specific.
So the first one's coming up. It's called Wither Vane. And again, this is a project where we're trying to consider the 21st century weather vane. So quite often our work starts from researching points of disuse, and specifically around disused objects and how to reclaim them and actually give them agency again. So in this case, we were really interested in what we call agripunk. So we were looking at the weather vane as an original information system. And if we were asking a weather vane in this day and age what it needs to forecast for us, it was really about the internet and actually the level of fear that's pervasive through the internet and through our 24/7 media environment. So instead of being powered by the wind, it's being powered by the level of fear on the internet being parsed by routers' news feeds using the Homeland Security social media monitoring handbook for keywords.
So basically we have 5 headless chickens which are controlled by the level of fear. So routers' news feeds come in from all over the world. That is identified as a text string which identifies the location on the planet where something has happened. We've done some workshops in Folkestone where this is going to be in August, and we've actually taken some additional keywords from the local population about what they are afraid of. Folkestone is 22 miles from France. It's the first port of entry in the UK, and it's currently the local government is the UK Independence Party, which is anti-immigration. So there's a lot of things happening in the local community about particularly anti-Eastern European immigrants arriving in the UK. So we want to create a system where it evidences what is going on globally and locally in terms of manifesting that how fear is ever present and pervasive, and makes the way that we think different based on the news media.
So in general, we've been playing with a series of projects which we call apokanoia. So it's the apocalypse plus paranoia about the apocalypse. So the next project more specifically deals with this.
This is a bug-out location tactical shelter, and this was a residency that we did at the Center for Land Use Interpretation in Wendover, Utah. And what this is thinking about what architecture that would deal with the electromagnetic spectrum. So it's architecture for the non-visual. So thinking about the surveillance from drones, we did a series of experiments looking at robotically manufactured textiles which repel and deal with either infrared, ultraviolet, machine vision, or whatever. And we tested this on the airbase where the planning for the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was carried out.
So some of our work really touches on humor. We sort of are really interested in the performative and also how we can create social objects in urban comfort, specifically in urban environments that we feel are kind of stressed urban environments. So some of our work is really about kind of these temporary, almost hit and run installations that explore architecture and explore socialization and interaction. So with Me Not Me, we were really looking at how do you build something that's out of 250 translucent beach balls in 2 nylon skins that have accelerometers and LEDs, that the more you push it and the more you play with it as a group on mass and public during electricity, the more it actually responds to you. So this was a really tactile feedback system and a kind of architecture of socialization. So.
Yeah, and Me Not Me stems from, in childhood psychology, there's a stage where the security blanket or the teddy bear is the first thing that a child has which belongs to it but is not it. So this was an insertion into the streetscape of Detroit for night where it was, the invitation was for people to actually engage and interact with the object. Okay, so basically our basic message is that you're here, you're now, and you have agency, so act.
Thanks.
Thank you, Cezanne and John. Our next panelist is Jeff Bordeaux.
Hello, hello, hello. Am I working?
There's a switch on that one.
Yeah, I have it on. A different switch? Yeah. Is it working? It's working now. Hi. I'm Jeff Bordeaux. And I speak low, so just waiting for this. We'll find out. There I am. There I am. So I threw these slides together because I wasn't sure we hadn't gotten the questions yet, but there are answers here. This is a show, as an artist, my work dealt with what was happening in the art world, whether it was critical or just trying to understand the whole process, trying to figure out who decides art. Is it the museum, the gallery, the collector, the audience, the artist himself? And slowly I'm finding out. I don't think I ever will find out the answer because it kind of shifts right now. It seems like there's art hedge funds that are deciding what art is. But at this point, it was the artist was always the last one, which is fine. I think the artist creates his work and throws it out there, and then everybody else decides what to do with it. So this was a show I was in Kalamazoo Institute of Arts, and my pieces here, it was called American Beauty, and it was about abuse, basically, and an abused child. And the piece itself was abused. The last day of the show, someone took the hammer to the piece and destroyed it. They're upset, all the ironies in art. They're upset by the notion that I was portraying abuse, that they took the hammer and this purported child, that they smashed it. And so it was a great show. There was Cindy Sherman, Serrano, and a lot of other artists. This was a show, I did it twice. I did it in the mid-90s. I was going to do a show called Painting in the 90s because painting was supposed to be dead in the 90s. And at this point, I had created a museum. I was coming back from an exhibition I had in Chicago, and it's 4 hours, and trying to figure out why I have to go somewhere else to have a career, why I can't have a career as an artist in Detroit. And there were a lot of different reasons, but one of the main reasons was because we didn't have a contemporary museum here. So I went through all the arguments. What does it take to make a contemporary museum? Lots of money, patrons, huge space, and decided you don't need any of that, just come back and do it. So when I got back, I was going to do painting in the 90s because it was supposed to be dead and to see who was actually out there painting. But I opened up Art Magazine and even had a centerfold. It was Serrano's History of Sex. I think the centerfold was of a naked woman milking a horse, or masturbating a horse, I should say. So I thought, it seemed to be the only thing that shocked people anymore was religion or sex in the arts. So I did the show called Naked in the 90s, and it went well. The attorney from the city where I founded the museum, Pontiac, showed up, and she said it was unofficial. She kind of spun on her heels in the room and looked at me and said, "This is art. I've seen it before," and she left. A couple years later, I had a run-in with the DIA. They shut down my show, and this was going to be part of it. And part of the idea to do it this time, the first time it was all nicely matted and framed. This time I wanted to do it like the crazy janitor that has the boiler room with all his images just taped up on the wall. So I used the same images, but it had a different effect. The police came in and raided the place and charged me with obscenity. One of the critics who had supported the first show saw this show and thought it was all trash, even though they were the same exact images. So it's interesting on presentation, too, of how you show your art. And went through several meetings at the court. I didn't have a lawyer, found out you really needed one, and so what's amazing, I saw some poor guy walk in and he got the book, and then the next guy comes in with a lawyer, and the lawyer is saying, "Hey, Joe," to the judge, and anyway, you need a lawyer, whatever you do. They eventually dismissed the case. I was a little disappointed in that because some of the stuff, like Mapplethorpe's work with the finger pushed inside of another man's penis and stuff, there's a borderline in art where it does cross over, or can cross over into pornography. And so when does it do that? And those kind of questions I hoped that the trial would resolve without putting me in prison. But they were never answered. And that's a policeman, which is also strange. He had his Polaroid, and they were taking what they thought were the most disgusting images in the show. And the most disgusting image in the show was Courbet's Origin of the World from like 1868. Then he and the police chief, who was dressed all in leather with a leather cap too, were kind of looking and like having fun trying to find the dirtiest pictures. Part of what I found the museum for too is interaction with not just artists but with the audience. During the performance of Oldenburg and people like that in the Fluxus, the audience kind of mingled and became part of the performance, and then at some point it split off, and instead of being partners in the art, the performance, they became the audience. They sat in the seats and watched the performances. So my background is in fiction writing and as a playwright too. And so I wanted to create a space where the audience, knowingly or unknowingly, became part of what was around them, what was in the museum. We did a couple things. This one was called Kaboom. We had artists give us work to be destroyed, essentially. And so I examined all the episodes all the way back to, I can't remember the name of the French group, but they were pre-Dada and Surrealists. They were like 1898. They drew a mustache on Venus de Milo at the museum. So the audience had fun with it. Everything was destroyed. We had a replica of Duchamp's urinal, the fountain, and someone urinated in it, so that was good. But then we had some other things, some of his pictures of the Mona Lisa, and someone had set those on fire, and somebody told me about it, so I had to run to that gallery and put that out with the urine from the urinal. And we had to mock up a small miniature of Tyree Guyton's Heidelberg, so we had a small house with all the dots on it, and we had a wrecking ball to destroy it. Now they're being burned, but back then they're being threatened to be bulldozed. So after somebody destroyed the house, they started working on the walls. So it went better than we thought. And with this piece, they did what they wanted. I mean, these were replicas these were dolls you could get of Anne, whatever her name is. People know her. She was famous for taking babies, pictures of them dressed like, pardon? Yeah, Ann Geddes. Then there was some bug killer that you could pour in and kill them. But instead, I think I told somebody, stop setting fires, and so they wrote "fuck art" rules. So no matter what you do, there's never enough freedom. And this was, when I came back from Chicago, this was the space that I rented for $1 a year. It was a walk-in closet and a gallery, and I turned it into a museum. And so I took images from magazines and art books and cut them out and matted and framed them and put the shows together that way. So we could have a show. This is like 1996, 97. And could only really fit about 4 or 5 people. This is a show I'm proud of. It was about 3 months after 9/11. We did a show called Ground Zero and invited artists to bring in work that, however they felt about it. And it wasn't all political. Most of it was sympathetic. And I have a friend now who felt distance from the actual event because they weren't in New York. They didn't have connections. And you just saw what you saw on TV. But going through this, she wept. But I thought this was one of the most poignant things, especially what happened later with Abu Ghraib and the prisons and what was going on in the prisons and the way people were being treated in America initially, the Arab community. This fellow had never, the artist that did this piece had never done anything before. He just wanted to be an artist, and so he came to town and he wanted to rent a dog kennel cage, and he rented an Arab actor to sit in there and to be heaped with abuse, which people were reluctant to do, maybe because other people were watching or they were more sympathetic. So I ended up having to insult them. That's that.
All right, thank you, Jeff. And our fifth panelist, of course, is our visiting artist, Mary Miss, who we're very fortunate to have lecture at University of Detroit last night. Do you want to give a quick introduction to yourself?
I was unsure what slides were going to be here. Let me look and see what you have. It's been a long path from the 1980s or whenever Rosalind Krauss wrote this article about sculpture in the expanded field. But over the decades, I've really been interested in the role that artists or visual thinkers, artists in the broadest sense of the word, could have in our culture. And I was interested in how it would be possible to have a place at the table. I think, just to go back to that article briefly, it was very hard for people within the art world to understand what the implications were. I think they missed the boat totally. Because as soon as artists stepped into that expanded field, there was no longer any dialogue that continued because it wasn't within the art context. So really, art has to be within the art context for it to be considered. So as years went on, I ended up developing something called City as Living Laboratory, Sustainability Made Tangible Through the Arts. And it was really, I'd done a lot of urban scale projects, and I was interested in how you could get cities to begin to realize that they had this great resource with visual thinkers and with the imagination that people in the arts could bring to the table. And this is an image from a project that was done in Boulder, Colorado, where it was organized by a critic named Lucy Lepard, and it was called Weather Report, Art and Climate Change. And Boulder is at the mouth of a canyon, and it's predicted that there's going to be a devastating flood. As we know, this fall there was a modest flood which caused severe damage in Boulder. But I collaborated with scientists in Boulder to mark the predicted flood level that they are really worried about. And as much as the scientists would end up talking about these issues, it was very hard to get people to consider things that they had never experienced before or wasn't within historical memory. So we put up these 300 blue discs, very simple, through the center core of Boulder. And what it allowed people to do was measure in terms of their own bodies this line that stayed very consistent. But because of the contour of the land, sometimes these marks were ankle high and sometimes they were 18 feet in the air. We also marked boulders that a geologist had studied that had been moved by a flood of this severity before Boulder was settled as a town. And these things were about the size of a panel truck. So people could see that it wasn't just that water was going to be flowing nicely down the stream, but it was going to be coming at a tremendous rate. Let's see what else is here. This is what started the conversation of sculpture in the expanded field, and it was a series of structures that I built in 4 acres, but the centerpiece was this underground work. It's about a 30-foot square opening, 20-foot square. I'm forgetting, it's been such a long time. But you could actually walk down into this, and you couldn't tell how far the ground was undermined that you had just walked across. Nope, let's see. I'm going to stop with this one. This is such a melange of times and places. I'm getting confused myself. But with this work, it was really bringing up the question, what's art, what's architecture? And I've really had this career of crossing boundaries between territories, whether it's engineering or art. And in recent years, I've spent a lot of time collaborating with scientists, and this City as Living Laboratory is really based on the idea of collaboration and being able to get the kind of content about our world and how we are dependent on the natural systems around us, and as well as the infrastructure, trying to find ways to communicate that to people that's not preaching but is engaging in some way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. As I mentioned at the top of this hour, we're going to continue the conversation based on some of the themes that Mary brought up in her lecture last night regarding art in public space. One of the things that I'd like to start out with is an understanding of the shift that's happened in the last 30 years. So traditional modes of public art tended to be sort of monumental in nature and scale, large sculptures or memorials. But since basically the 1970s, because of work of people like Mary, artists like Mary, this monumentality has shifted to smaller scaled, interactive, even educational installations. And I wonder if we could start this conversation talking about this shift from monumentality to interactivity and its connection to the culture of both creating and consuming public art. Maybe you could start with what drove this shift, the artist or the audience?
From my point, the monument is placed in a location. It's placed in a site, and the audience that attends and pays attention to that thing are participant within it. So I would argue that the interactivity is there even with the monument. I think the lens that you look through is, here is this artifact which has been placed in the space, but the thing is, it's actually a focus, it's within a system. And I think what it is just those, as we've become technologically able to actually create a feedback mechanism through the work. The object has become a subject in a more conscious way, and the object can be influenced and affected by the audience. So I would say that it's an extension of, but it depends on what the lens that you're looking through is.
Am I on? I'd like to argue the opposite, that the art, not that point, but the notion of things becoming less monumental. I think they're becoming more monumental. Like Mary's Underground was 4 acres, and some of her other projects take up large areas. Frank, I found a quote that helps me from Frank Gehry. Most of our cities built since the war are bland, they're modernist, they're cold, and now architects want to go back to that. But there are people in the community who want a little more juice, something to relate to, and so they seek out artists, and artists they seek out have become, this is his opinion, have become very wealthy, and they have big studios, and they do large monumental works. And he notes Olafur Eliasson, who did the Waterfall Project, which I think cost like $60 million in New York, which is like the most money that's been spent since Christo and Jean-Claude did the gates there, which were monumental. And Anish Kapoor, who I think Rockefeller Center, he put one of his sky mirrors, which is 3 feet tall. It's a polished stainless steel. And there's the Bean in Chicago. And they're interactive, and they're bigger than themselves, too. I mean, even Bean, everybody goes there to take a picture of themselves being distorted in the Bean. The piece in the Rockefeller Center is concave, but when you look into it, you see not just you, but you see the entire urbanscape, but also the sky. So I think in different ways they're becoming more monumental, and I think that spilled over into the museums themselves, where an artist just doesn't come in and show their paintings or their photographs. A lot of the times, to make it more interesting to draw bigger audiences, they include elements of installation. Recently, Scott Hocking had a show at Hilberry where he did his photography, but he also included a bed of salt with a rotted old Buick on top of it and a bunch of boxes. So I think that things are pushing more towards the monumental. I made a list of a lot of them. I won't go through it. But one of them, there was one in Detroit, and I don't know if anybody here remembers it, because it happened and it left, and I never knew it happened. It was by Mel Chin. And he took a house and things, yeah. And the only way I knew about it, because it was a part of the project on Art 21. And before I came, I was trying to find it on the web, and there's not even a picture of it. It happened, because in Art 21 they show him cutting the house and lifting it and doing things. Okay. So I don't know if it was because it was a tender topic at that time, urban blight and what he was doing to point his finger. It's always been sensitive. There was a show, I think it was at the Whitney in 1990. I could be wrong, but anyway, it looked like everything was going towards social art in the 80s. This opened up at the Whitney, and I forget the artist, the photographer had gone around taking photographs of all the different homeless people in New York. And there was even one, then they printed them out life-size, and one was leaning up against the desk when you first walk in of a homeless person, and everybody hated it. And that was kind of the end of it, and then the young British artist kind of took over.
Let's
I'm just saying that it's become more interactive and monumental at the same time.
Right. I mean, maybe the question is, at what place, what sequence does the interactivity take place? So if maybe we can talk about the interactivity within the creation of the art versus in the consumption of the art, something where an engagement with the community in the creation of art itself.
Yeah, I think that's been happening. The monumental shrinking down, I don't think it's been happening in my experience, but I could be wrong.
I'm going the opposite direction. I'm really interested in using 300 6-inch diameter tin can lids to make a work. I did a project in Indianapolis a couple of years ago that was along a 6-mile stretch of the White River, and basically it was, to use kind of a familiar term, it was kind of like acupuncture, where these 100 points decoded something about the landscape, about the particular place you were standing in. It consisted of a mirror that you could see yourself in with a red mark, 1.5-inch red mark on it, and then I would put a 6-inch diameter red sphere at the point that I wanted you to take note of, whether it was a CSO or the levee that you were standing on or a fish hatchery. But I'm really, I think since the time I started out in the 70s, it's been about trying to go in the opposite direction of the monument and taking away as much as I can and trying to find how you can have an intense engagement with the most modest of elements.
Well, it seems like
I'm
there's-
trying to go the other way.
I think for us, it's really been about kind of beginning to think about things from that event-specific point of view, which in some cases really took a kind of performative, spectacle-based approach to dealing with an audience or treating an audience, and then moving along that axis to something which is much more about experience-specific. So I think early works of ours really started from that site-specific place and then has moved into this kind of vein where we're looking at modes of co-creation. And it's gestural. I mean, some works deserve a large scale and a heft and a weight, and then some are about those quiet moments, because for every Eliason that you can think of that is big and monumental, he also put, thousands of white Lego bricks in a town square, and asked the public to actually reconsider and redesign their own town square. So I think there is this notion that you are tailoring your practice and you are tailoring your medium, you're tailoring your work a little bit more to the cause that you're actually trying to pick through, or the issue you're trying to pick through, rather than kind of adhering to maybe not monument, but monolith. And I think that's the shift for me.
Yeah,
It's moving from monumental to monolithic.
It seems like there's scale, which is kind of what Jeff's referring to, and then there's scope. And the work that Mary's describing is more about scope. And you can cover a large area and really make a point with even the simplest of materials, and it includes paint can lids, and it's more about suggesting an event or a larger thing that's taking place, as opposed to just concentrating all that energy and money, which is a big part of it, which often goes undiscussed, in one place. And so, but I do think there's a place for the pieces that Jeff's talking about. I mean, there's the stars, there's the big players, but then there's also a lot of small things that take place at the local level all over the whole country, and they're not always giant things. Granted, there's a few made players that sort of circulate in the percent for art programs, but in general, though, there is a shift, and I don't think that it's totally cynical and kind of only run by a few giant players and a few huge pieces. But I think there's a place for those because they also draw attention to how this idea of art is having another potential context, and they are kind of the liaisons in a sense with the public, that there's more going on here than just the gallery, because we know what we're talking about. This is our context. This is where we think. But everybody else, the people that I call normal people, that's a completely different circumstance. And I really think that part of the interactive work and the work that sort of embraces the public serves that function to sort of invite people to join in. And even the bean is celebrated, and I mean,
Everybody loves it, yeah.
What's that?
Everybody loves it. I'm not saying monumental is a bad thing. I'm just saying it's expresses itself differently. So the Indianapolis elevated walkway was, 6 miles? But it's more intimate at the same time because people can work with the mirrors and the markers. But you're talking about 6 miles instead of one statue in one little park.
Right.
So that's what I mean about monumentality is still there. It's become more intimate at the same time. I think it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I just don't. I think things have gotten bigger, and bigger can be better.
Does this open up a conversation about the economics of public art? We no longer have these single philanthropists giving large amounts of money to put up a memorial although we do still have the patrons who will pay for an Eliason, but now we have this, recently this kind of grant-giving mechanism of small amounts of money from very large foundations to go to less well-known artists in their local communities. Is that part of this shift to dealing with the scope of the city, the public space of the city, versus the scale of a large, expensive piece of artwork in a plaza?
I mean, I think since we have the rise of creative placemaking in the U.S., whether it's funded through Art Place or through the Kresge Foundation, you see a kind of meeting of top-down kind of connoisseurship, the way that we used to think about curating in the built environment, to something that really is about trying to navigate a very tricky and a very sticky terrain, which is about community building through art, or community engagement through art, or sort of the resiliency of neighborhoods through art, and through the agency that artists can provide in those spaces. And I think there's a recognition that the local artist in that context is almost always best placed to engage. Even if they're working, say for instance, with a name artist who's come into town to do the big heavy lifting of the project, there's normally a team of kind of local artists that are engaged in the actual work of community building, and then what happens to the project, afterwards as it continues to live in a community. And so I think we see a kind of mixing of both top-down, bottom-up, and what we're now seeing through foundations as the middle through, right? Where they're instigating challenges, they're instigating the city as a laboratory, they're instigating kind of upstart projects.
How do you think that evolved? I'm trying to create an internal, a mental timeline of that shift from kind of personal, I don't want to say egotistical, but like the solo artist making their thing and leaving their mark, even if it's a monumental piece with good intent and actually functioning, to like more community-based pieces. And I'm thinking back on my own personal experience. I've received 2 grants from ArtServe over the years ago, and they both came kind of right at the end of the Jesse Helms NEA flap. And there was a transition that took place as a result of that, kind of a top-down push to emphasize community and to try to justify art and the presence of art at a public level, because it was starting to get this impression. I mean, it's not necessarily totally deserved, but a little bit, as just kind of very esoteric and really way off the beaten path, but yet publicly funded enterprise. And so I'm picturing that as being not maybe a huge factor, but part of it, that there was this sudden shift that, well, wait, we can't just be doing this all for ourselves, that we need to be engaging. And then I think of all the cheers when Sarah's Tilted Arc was taken out of its home, that maybe that would kind of increase this awareness of how we have to think about the people that this work affects on a daily basis, and maybe that's a place to start.
I have to say that I think it started before, not as a reaction to, and particularly the 70s were this period in New York, anyway, where the boundaries were kind of dissolving between fields, whether it was the dancers and the sculptors and the poets. People were really overlapping. Technology had kind of come in. In the late 60s, with some of the events that were staged in the Armory and in California. But I think another important thing was the women's movement that emerged in the 70s. And it was really, there was this other way of looking things that wasn't about, it was no longer about the monument or the monolith. It was about engagement and a different kind of means of relating to people. And I think that had kept going forward in a sometimes more visible way, sometimes less visible. But I don't think it just is something that came out of the kind of behave yourselves and be good and don't do any dirty pictures.
I was thinking of it more of as that all of that taking place is more of a symptom, or maybe had a minor impact, and especially locally. I remember being told and kind of scolded as I was applying for grants that I really had to make sure that my projects that I was proposing would could benefit the community, and I had to come up with actual seminars and sessions, and that was a shift. I'm not saying that it wasn't happening earlier, but it's interesting how that became actually kind of part of the process as opposed to. It's just a minor little footnote. I don't really feel that was all that was taking place.
Yeah, I think it's interesting where the money comes for these projects. The government NEA was providing quite a bit for a while until that started getting chopped away at. Then it moved towards the corporate. Then 9/11 happened. Things that were being funded here by companies, everybody sets aside a certain amount of money to give to the arts, the corporations. That all went to New York. And it never came back because then the big bus came. So Mary's had projects, I think, that she's wanted to do that the funding just never materialized. So I think she can tell us where the funding might be now, if anywhere.
Well, I think one of the things that's really been interesting to me over the decades is trying to invent a territory to operate. I spoke last night about percent for art being the most viable means of working in the public realm, but it was always such an insult to be offered that 1% or 0.5% and be given a very set situation. So I really became interested in how I could make my own territory. And yes, I did proposal after proposal, that finally would not be funded. You'd get to the end and, the art was the first thing that got cut out of the budget when there were cost overruns. And that definitely has had an effect on what I want to do and how I want to do it. And recently, I've been working through collaborations at getting money from, for instance, the National Science Foundation, where the amounts of money are considerable. Of course, you have to find something within that territory that is of interest to you. But I just am very interested in artists finding different ways of operating. That's what's worked for me recently. But I think inventing, repositioning yourself and, kind of trying to find new ways of being funded, but particularly being seen as an asset. I think that's one of the hardest things, to be taken seriously as participants who have a tremendous amount to add. And so that's been that big push for me behind the City as Living Laboratory, is really getting cities to understand this asset at hand.
I'm guessing a lot of support comes from some of the cities, like New York, maybe. Right? I think some cities are more generous than others to support these.
It depends on who the mayor likes and if he's a billionaire.
Who the mayor is.
Well, if we're talking about the perception, let's say, of public art, and suggesting that we do have simultaneously both that traditional top-down type of art and now this bottom-up, is it about the nature of how do you critique public art? So does the kind of current interactive, socially driven public art eliminate or enhance those traditional roles of abject aesthetics or memorialization? How do we critique this new public art as compared to how we were used to critiquing sculpture, let's say?
Does it replace it, or is it just creating a new place? Is it?
Well, is there a different set of criteria for the critique of art? I mean, part of what defines art is we have to be able to critique it, right? We can argue about what makes something art, but at the very basic level, we can critique it. So there's a history, a tradition of norms of critiquing public sculpture, let's say. How does the past 30 years of this top-down, socially interactive, socially driven public art, is it critiqued differently? Does it have a different set of standards? And is that influencing the perception of it, which maybe would influence how much money can be sort of granted to it by these larger institutions that are happy to throw $60 million at an Eliason, but Mary struggles to get enough money to put up, her discs on a 6-mile stretch of the White River.
You want to tackle
Well,
that?
no, I just think it's just art supposedly is always evolving, changing, and I think that this is more intimate with the viewer. We're talking about the sculpture, the public works, that it's something that, there's somebody that was famous 100 years ago gets a monument, and how does that relate to the average Joe? Probably not a lot, but Mary's projects, they relate a lot to not just to the person, but the environment and to everything involved. So I'm guessing you have to critique it differently, but something different engagement too.
I think that one of the problems that I was referring to is that there is very little criticism of the work. In other words, there aren't, as soon as you stepped outside of the art context, the critical dialogue stopped. And I think it's something that's really necessary to, what's working and what's not working. It's not, I think there's so little discussion about what's being most effective in this territory. So I think it's a real loss.
I think maybe because it inhabits the environment instead of has its own little space, that it isn't necessarily seen as art. It's more interactive, and so maybe that's why there isn't the critique happening.
What about the diffusion of authorship? And because if there's a lot of people participating in something, then it's
That's for me. That's one of the major goals of art is to have the viewer become part author in the piece. They have to complete the piece, and Mary's pieces they do, and I think that's where art's moving.
So do you think that makes criticism a little difficult because it's not? You almost like can't pin down the.
Well, I don't
mean that in some literal
I think
sense, but-
people that experience aren't feeling this is art, because they're drawn into it. Art is something you view and then you critique it. This is something they're involved with in more ways than just the visual aesthetic or whatever. It's environmental, it's about them, it's about their lives. And so maybe there needs to be a new form of criticism but outside. I don't think the individual is going to be able to do it. And critics do it. But just go back to someone like Christo and Jean-Claude, who passed away. Their projects were all self-funded, and that's amazing in this day and time. So, but I think his latest project, Over the River, it's going on like maybe 10, 15 years trying to get it done, and they always get close, and then different groups come against it. So it's always difficult to do, and they're temporary too. And I met people that went to the Gates and they appreciated it, but they didn't really understand it on an art level, but they experienced it in a different way. And I think it was like the last day of the show that the work was up, it snowed, and so that gave it even a stronger effect to the audience. So I think it's broadening and expanding the artists in these works, and so it's difficult for art critics to wrap their heads around it too, maybe. They're more used to going to a gallery and looking at a painting and saying good or bad. I mean, there's all these different new criteria that are being put into place that a normal critic isn't used to dealing with. So maybe they're scared.
I mean, I think the authorship question definitely plays into it a lot. Quite often we give a presentation and the first question is, so what part of it do you do? And then when you actually try and explain that there's a role for an audience in most of our work, and that we kind of believe in open source and we really are interested in co-creation to the point that we can, then it starts becoming this really hard to pin down thing, I think, for a lot of people to grapple with. And it's almost like they feel ill-equipped to actually engage in the dialogue. So quite often we're not at the table with other artists, and I mean this is a kind of rare event for us, in that we're with other artists. 9 times out of 10 we're the one artist on a panel talking about something else, or the one designer on the panel talking about something else. And I think that that is something that happens when you step into that expanded field, and all of a sudden you're not being challenged on the rigor with which you perhaps trained and studied any longer, and you're being challenged in terms of thinking about how you're actually engaging in these larger sets of systems and kind of what the metrics are in that kind of system, rather than kind of maybe in the domain discourse that you trained in.
I mean, is that part of the difficulty, that if every viewer is essentially a collaborator, then any critique of this is self-criticism, and not everyone is prepared to do that in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of the things we talk about with the me, not me piece is that, at one point in time in the night, I think 20 people body slammed into it while we were standing there, and they had their own agency around it, and they took photographs around it, and it went out on Instagram. And so we were able to kind of track and follow some of that interaction. And at that point, it really ceases to be the work that we worked on, right? It's being molded and shaped by a public, and then it's being represented through other digital means and mechanisms that become part of their life, their Facebook feed. That's what's really interesting to us. I think it is a new type of criticism, but I think it demands a different rigor and role than perhaps in the same way that we're being challenged as artists and designers. I think the critic's role is being challenged in this new space where everybody is a critic and everybody is a curator of culture.
I think, yeah, going with that, I think the audience becomes, they create well, not complete. Anyway, a new sense of ownership than they would with that statue in the park. They become owners of what they're interacting with, and that's what interaction's about. Every piece of art is about interaction. It's about what the viewer comes and sees and brings out of a piece, and if it engages them or not. Where the work that we're talking about gives a sense of ownership because the viewer is more complicit in some ways into this new type of public art that's being out there. So it becomes more theirs. There's always a dual authorship to it with the viewer and the artist, but now I think it's more one-on-one, more 50-50 or whatever, sometimes even the other way. A lot of these people aren't even I'm sure don't even know that they're viewing a piece of art. Mm-hmm. They're interacting with something in their environment. Anyway, that wasn't clear, but I understand it.
Well, I suppose as moderator, it's my role to call time. I think our hour is up. I want to thank Jeff Bordeaux, Cezanne Charles, John Marshall, Michael McGillis, and of course, Mary Miss for coming all this way to talk to us. So if we can please give them a round of applause. And thank you to Lawrence Tech for hosting. And have a good night.
Yeah.